The first time I saw the night guard creeping along the back row at 2 in the morning, I thought I was hallucinating from another double shift. I stood at my upstairs window, still in scrubs, watching the beam of his flashlight slide across the fences like he was hunting for something nobody else could see, the parking lot lights buzzing softly in the cold air. The tape measure clipped to his belt glinted every time he shifted, and I realized he wasn't just walking his route. He was stopping, bracing, and measuring. He paused behind my unit longer than anywhere else, shoulders hunched, writing something on his clipboard while my cat tracked him from the sill like he was prey. The association had emailed about a routine inspection next Tuesday, but no one mentioned a graveyard shift measuring spree. Standing there in that weird mix of anger and exhaustion, I felt the first real jolt of dread that this was not going to be a normal reminder letter about paint touch-ups. It was the start of something much pettier. I had no idea yet that a single number on that clipboard would be used as a weapon, or that a quiet line in bylaw 2.7 would become my shield. I just knew the guard's tape measure clicked out an extra notch when he got in my fence, and that sound lodged in my brain like the opening note of my own HOA nightmare. To understand why that tape measure mattered, you have to picture the place I live. It's a packed townhome row, 3 long buildings facing each other with a narrow strip of parking between them, like someone squeezed a whole neighborhood into one city block. On summer evenings, the air smells like grilled burgers and cheap charcoal, and on winter mornings, you hear the distant hum of the freeway mixing with the scraping of ice off windshields. Every unit has the same tiny concrete patio out back, each boxed in by a 6-foot privacy fence the color of wet cardboard. When I bought my place 3 years earlier, the association bragged about the uniform aesthetic and low-maintenance lifestyle. They said the board handled everything. I just had to pay dues on time and follow a few simple rules. At the time, that sounded like a fair trade for being 10 minutes from the hospital where I work. The board itself felt more like a distant rumor than a real presence. There was the president, Ms. Alvarez, who appeared once a year in the newsletter in a blazer and pearls, smiling next to a potted plant. The treasurer, Mr. K, was a retired actuary who wrote long paragraphs about reserve funds and repair schedules, with little charts no one read. The property manager, Denise, was the one we actually saw, usually speeding through the lot in a compact car, snapping photos of landscaping and cracked sidewalks. For the most part, they left us alone. People stretched the rules in small ways. One neighbor added a string of fairy lights to their fence. Another set a potted lemon tree right on the line. My own violation was barely that. When I moved in, I added a wooden topper along the inside of my fence, an extra 4 inches of slats to keep my cat from popping her head over and scaring the neighbor's dog. The original fence was still visible from the outside. Same color, same line. It just felt a little more private, and no one seemed to care. That changed the night of the noise complaint. I work nights as a nurse, mostly in critical care, which means my schedule feels like somebody threw a clock into a blender. On a Thursday in early March, I came home from 3 brutal shifts in a row, slept hard all afternoon, then decided to meal prep before going back in. It was barely 7 p.m., the sun was still fading behind rows of roofs, and I had music playing at what I thought was a reasonable volume while I chopped vegetables. By Monday, I had a letter stuffed into my mailbox with a bright red header, Notice of Noise Disturbance, courtesy warning. The paper felt heavier than normal as I unfolded it at my kitchen counter, the overhead light humming faintly. It listed my unit number, the date of the incident, and a vague reference to loud music and thumping noises after quiet hours. Attached it was a photocopied incident report from the security contractor, a neat little form dated March 3rd at 23:17, with a box check for excessive noise and a scribbled note that the complainant was neighbor in adjacent unit bedroom wall. That was my first evidence prop, a flimsy page that said in bureaucratic language that someone had written me up for existing. I didn't think much of it at first. It was a courtesy warning, no fine yet, just a reminder about quiet hours being 10 p.m. to 7 a.m. I rolled my eyes, made a mental note to use headphones more often, and tossed the letter into my HOA stuff folder. Every community like this has one. It's the place where newsletters and random policy updates go to die. A week later, the tone shifted. An email from a management company landed in my inbox with the subject line, upcoming property inspection, mandatory participation. The body was cheerful. Spring was coming. The association wanted to make sure everything was safe, compliant, and aesthetically harmonious. They mentioned patios, fences, railings, and noise-sensitive features. It read like a generic reminder. But at the bottom, in smaller type, there was a line about height compliance for perimeter fencing per CCR bylaw 2.7. I remember frowning at that line, the glow of my laptop screen reflecting off a half-eaten microwave dinner. Bylaw 2.7. I had never noticed that number before. The email said fences needed to conform to the original approved height of 6 feet, as measured from finished grade at the center of the lot line. It sounded technical and harmless. I assumed they were targeting the guy 2 buildings over who had built a pergola that looked like a pirate ship. I found out how wrong I was the next time I dragged my trash to the dumpster, pinned to the community bulletin board. Beneath the usual lost cat flyers and dog walking offers was a fresh notice from the board. It was printed on thick cream paper with the association logo at the top and announced a fence height compliance initiative effective immediately. It referenced a recent uptick in noise concerns, privacy disputes, and unauthorized modifications, and said the board was partnering with their security contractor to measure and document all perimeter fencing for compliance with CCR bylaw 2.7. I stood there in my hoodie, trash bag in hand, reading it twice while the smell of bleach drifted from the laundry room behind me. If a fence was too tall, it said, the owner would receive a written notice and be required to bring it into compliance within 14 days to avoid potential fines. It didn't say how much those fines would be. It just hinted at them, like a shadow at the edge of your vision. My extra 4 inches of privacy suddenly felt like a neon sign. The first official letter about my fence arrived 3 days later, folded into a bland white envelope that looked harmless until I saw the association's return address. The paper rustled sharply as I opened it, standing in the narrow entryway with my shoes still on and the faint tick-tick of a neighbor's sprinkler tapping against their siding outside. The heading was different this time. Fence height noncompliance. Courtesy notice. They quoted bylaw 2.7 now like it was scripture. According to their measurement, taken at the center of the lot line from finished grade to top of structure, my fence was approximately 4.5 inches above the approved height. They acknowledged the unapproved modification as an interior topper, but argued that any vertical extension counted toward the total. The letter claimed the added height may contribute to amplified sound reflection and uneven privacy conditions, and needed to be removed before the upcoming inspection Tuesday, March 24th. They even bolded the date. I flipped the page over and found a compliance timeline chart. It broke everything down like a school assignment. First notice sent March 10th. Inspection scheduled for March 24th. Final compliance deadline March 31st. If the fence remained non-compliant after that, fines may be assessed at a rate determined by the board, up to and including daily penalties. It was worded so carefully that they didn't commit to any specific numbers, just dangled the threat of money in front of me like a bad omen. The part that stuck with me, though, was a line near the bottom. Measurements conducted by on-site security personnel under the direction of the board will be considered accurate for enforcement purposes. No mention of a second opinion. No mention of appeals. Whatever the tape measure said, I was supposed to accept. That made the memory of the night guard crouching behind my unit at 2 a.m. feel different. It stopped being an odd detail and became the opening move. In 4 days, that midnight measurement in a single line of fine print would be twisted into a threat against my home, and I was not about to let a stranger's tape decide my future. From that point on, I started paying attention. I noticed the guard more often, his reflective vest catching light as he made his round behind the buildings, always with that clipboard in hand. His name tag said Earl, and he moved with the slow confidence of someone who knew the cameras were on his side. He would walk past some units without stopping, then spend extra time at others, bracing his tape against the ground, squinting, writing. It wasn't random. The units he lingered at had one thing in common. They were the ones where people had pushed back on small things. The woman who hung seasonal wreaths that weren't approved colors, the couple with a satellite dish hidden behind a planter, the guy with the pirate ship pergola. And then there was me, the nurse who got a noise complaint that suddenly turned into a fence compliance issue. Neighbors started talking in the parking lot, in the laundry room, in low voices in the mail area. No one used names, but you could tell everyone was watching their backs. Someone mentioned getting a similar letter about their fence being a few inches too tall. Another said they were told their fence was too low, which made no sense until you realized the board could always find a number they didn't like if they wanted leverage. The more I listened, the clearer the pattern felt. The board had found a new toy in bylaw 2.7, and they were going to use it. The official explanation, of course, was safety and uniformity. The newsletter that month led with a cheery paragraph about ensuring consistent privacy and reducing sound transmission between units. It included a tiny diagram of a fence with an arrow pointing to 6 feet, as if the whole controversy could be reduced to a cartoon. They tucked a small note at the end about the association retaining sole discretion in interpreting measurement points. That phrase made the hairs on my arm stand up. Sole discretion. That's another way of saying we can stretch this rule like taffy, and you just have to swallow it. I pulled out my HOA stuff folder one evening and laid everything on the kitchen table. The original purchase packet was there, thick and smug, with the covenants, conditions, and restrictions booklet on top. I had skimmed it when I moved in, circling pet rules and parking policies, but I never bothered with the dense sections full of legal language and cross-references. Now I opened straight to the index and hunted for 2.7. When I found it, the wording was almost boring. It stated that fences must not exceed 6 feet in height, as measured from finished grade at the center of the shared lot line, matching the language from the email. But there were little details that didn't make it into the board's bold letters. It mentioned average grade, for instance, in areas with slopes. It referenced structures attached to fences as separate items that might be considered case by case. It even acknowledged that soil could settle or shift. There was more wiggle room in those sentences than in any of the letters I had gotten. I highlighted those phrases and stuck a sticky note on the page. That CCR booklet became my second evidence prop. It wasn't just rules anymore. It was a map of the board's limits, and they were hoping no one would read it carefully. As the inspection date inched closer, the atmosphere in the townhome row thickened. You could feel it even in the way people parked. Usually, cars overlapped the painted lines a little, neighbors squeezing in wherever they could. Now everyone parked perfectly centered, like the association might measure the distance between bumpers next. Trash cans were lined up with military precision. Garden gnomes vanished from patios overnight. And every so often, usually late, I would catch a flash of that reflective vest behind the buildings, the sound of a tape measure snapping back into its casing, and I'd feel the pinch between my eyebrows tighten. The board had turned a simple fence rule into a quiet power game, and I was the tired nurse at the center of their new favorite calculation. The measurement behind my unit, taken in the dark by a man I had never met, was about to be treated as fact. The inspection on Tuesday was framed like an innocent checklist, but everything about the timing and the tone told me this was retaliation for a single noise complaint, and they were counting on me being too exhausted to argue. They did not realize that exhaustion, for someone like me, is not the same thing as surrender. I set the noise disturbance, courtesy warning, next to the fence height non-compliance notice. Both of them dated within 1 week on that same cluttered table. The dates lined up like dominoes. March 3rd for the noise, March 10th for the fence, March 24th highlighted for inspection. Seeing them together made the pattern impossible to ignore. I was done treating this as random policy. That was the moment I decided if they were going to play tape measure games, I would learn the exact rules better than they did. I checked the clock over the stove. It was close to midnight, the hum of the fridge deep in the quiet. Instead of going to bed, I reached for a pen, wrote 2.7 in big letters at the top of a fresh notepad page, and underneath it, I wrote the first question that would guide everything that followed. If they can weaponize a half-inch measurement against me, what happens when I measure them right back? I did not own a tape measure, but I own a stubborn streak, and that turned out to be more important. The next afternoon, after sleeping off a shift that had me listening to heart monitors beat for 12 straight hours, I drove to the hardware store. The automatic doors whooshed open, cool air smelling like lumber and fertilizer washing over me as I headed straight for the aisle with measuring tools. I bought a decent metal tape, a small level, and a pack of orange marking flags that gardeners use. The cashier made small talk about spring projects while I calculated how many hours of overtime I had just spent on supplies to defend 4 inches of wood. Back home, the clouds were low and gray, and a chilly breeze rattled the leaves caught against the base of the fences. I stepped into my tiny patio, shut the sliding door behind me, and started my own measurements. Standing on my concrete slab, I pressed the tape down to the dirt outside the fence line and extended it upward to the top of the original boards. 6 feet, almost exactly, depending on where I stood. Then I measured to the top of my interior topper and saw the number I already knew the board would point to, hovering annoyingly between 6'4" and 6'5". The soil dipped and rose in small waves, probably from years of erosion and patchy grass, and the number shifted each time I moved the end of the tape a few inches. If the rule was 6 feet at the center of the lot line from finished grade, then where, exactly, did they decide that center point was, and who decided what counted as finished grade in dirt that looked like a patchwork quilt? The more I measured, the more obvious it became that this was not about precision. It was about control. I walked along my patio, slipping the tape between the fence boards where I could, pushing the tab into the soil, and reading the numbers by the pale afternoon light filtering through thin clouds. At some spots, the original fence itself was a hair over 6 feet, especially where the ground dipped. At others, it came in under. I took photos on my phone every few feet, making sure the tape numbers were visible, the rough dirt and the worn fence boards captured in the same frame. There was a faint smell of someone's coffee drifting from an open kitchen window nearby, blending with the damp scent of soil. I marked a few points with the orange flags, pushing them into the strip of earth by the fence line, so I could find them again. As I worked, a neighbor from 2 doors down, a woman who always wore bright headbands when she jogged, passed by in a narrow common path. She slowed when she saw the tape and the flags, and gave me a look that did not need words. I explained in a few short sentences what the board had claimed, what the inspection notice said, and how the guard had been measuring at night. She nodded, then told me she had gotten a notice about her fence being too short, which seemed impossible until she mentioned that her yard sloped upward from the alley. She described the guard pressing his tape against the ground at the highest point next to her patio and measuring up to a spot where the fence boards had warped a bit, creating the worst possible reading. She felt like they were hunting for numbers that justified whatever narrative they wanted. I agreed, and we traded a few more details about our letters, both of us feeling that uneasy unity that comes when you realize you're not the only target. By the time I finished my own measurements, my phone was full of photos, my notepad had numbers scribbled down with arrows, and my hands were streaked with dirt. I sat at my tiny patio table and flipped back to the CCR booklet, matching my real-world data to the dry language on the page. Average grade, center of lot line, separate structures attached to fences. Nothing about midnight measurements or outsourced sole discretion. If the association wanted to hide behind the rule, then the exact wording of that rule was going to matter more than they expected. The inspection Tuesday arrived like a dentist appointment you could not reschedule. The association had said the inspection would take place between 9 a.m. and 4 p.m., which meant an entire day of waiting. Because of my hospital schedule, I had taken that day off work weeks earlier, assuming it would be a quick walkthrough. Now I treated it like a stakeout. I parked myself at my upstairs window, whenever I was not pacing, coffee mug in hand, watching the common areas through slightly dusty blinds. The property manager, Denise, arrived first in her compact car, the engine rumbling a little too loud for how early it was. She met the guard, Earl, near the mailboxes, both of them wearing that guard expression of people who know they are about to have a long day. They started at one end of the row, walking in step, Earl with his tape and clipboard, Denise with a tablet. I could see them pausing at certain units, comparing notes, snapping photos. When they reached my building, I went downstairs and stepped out to my patio, leaving the sliding door open so I could hear the faint murmur of their conversation. I knew I was not supposed to engage with them formally, but I was still allowed to exist in my own space and observe. They came around the back, brand logos on their jackets catching the thin sunlight, shoes crunching on gravel. Earl looked at my fence, looked at his clipboard, and then at me, He did not look surprised to see me. If anything, he looked mildly annoyed, as if I had ruined a private ritual. Without acknowledging my presence, he braced the tape against the dirt at what he clearly considered the center of the line and ran it up to the top of my interior topper. He called out the number to Denise, who tapped it into her tablet. I noted silently that he had chosen a patch of serious erosion, where the soil dipped lower than the spots I had flagged. At that exact point, the measurement looked worse for me than anywhere else along the fence. I watched the tape, the angle, the spot where the tab dug into the dirt. My brain, trained by years of reading exact medication orders and lab values, recorded every detail. Then I looked up at Denise and mentioned that bylaw 2.7 discussed average grade and center lot line, and that the soil next to my slab was visibly uneven. I kept my tone even and factual. She responded politely but non-committally, saying that their measurements followed standard procedure. Standard procedure, in this case, meant picking the number that served them best. They moved on and my stomach knotted. 3 days after the inspection, a thicker envelope arrived. It landed in my mailbox with soft thud, the late afternoon sun slanting across the lot as kids rode bikes in slow circles and car doors slammed. I took it upstairs, heart beating faster than I cared to admit, and opened it at the kitchen counter. This time, the heading was not gentle. In bold, centered text, it read, "Fence height non-compliance, second notice and fine assessment." The letter referenced the inspection date, March 24th, and claimed that my fence remained 4.5 inches above the approved height at the measurement point. It stated that, effective immediately, the board had assessed a one-time fine of $150 for failure to correct non-compliance after initial courtesy notice, with additional daily fines of $25 if the fence was not brought into compliance by March 31st. They had attached a small ledger-style box at the bottom, showing balance due $150, and a warning that unpaid fines could be converted to a personal assessment and ultimately a lien if left unresolved. The paper smelled faintly like printer ink and old carpet, and the numbers blurred for a second as anger and something colder pooled in my chest. Here it was, my first tangible cost. The association had taken a quiet noise complaint, twisted a vague rule, used a midnight measurement, and turned it into a dollar figure that might grow each day. If I did nothing, those $25 daily fines would add up faster than I could pick up extra shifts, and I knew the board would not hesitate to let a lien hang over my home if I gave them that power. That letter became my third evidence prop. I slid it into a clear plastic sleeve and placed it behind the CCR booklet in a cheap 3-ring binder I created that night. Inside that binder, I organized everything. The original noise complaint, the first courtesy notice about the fence, the inspection email, my phone photos of the tape against uneven soil, and now the second notice with an actual dollar amount. I added one more document to the binder, a printed copy of a state consumer protection page I had found after a late-night search about homeowner association fines. It was not legal advice, and I did not pretend to fully understand all the references, but it reminded me of one important fact. Associations had to follow their own published procedures, and owners had a right to notice and an opportunity to be heard before serious penalties. The board liked to write letters, as if everything was already decided. The law, in its dry way, suggested that might not be entirely true. Around the same time, rumors started spreading about other fines hitting mailboxes. The woman with the sloped yard down the path showed me her own second notice in the parking lot. The ink smeared slightly where her thumb had pressed into the page. Her fence was allegedly 2 inches too short now, and the board claimed that reduced privacy could affect the uniform appearance of the row. They fined her for not raising it, even though their earlier emails had obsessed about fences being too tall. It was impossible not to see the pattern. They were using the same rule in opposite directions, depending on the homeowner. Whenever someone had previously pushed back about something, their fence now had a problem. This was turning into full-blown homeowners association drama, the kind of slow burn situation that people from the outside call ridiculous until you show them the receipts. I knew there was one place where the board could not spin the narrative quite as freely: the monthly meeting. They still had to publish an agenda and allow owner comments, even if they tried to rush through them. The April agenda appeared on the community portal about a week after the inspection. Buried in the list of items after landscaping updates and pool opening schedule was a line that made my jaw clench. Policy clarification. Fence height enforcement per CCR 2.7. Next, there was a note that the board would be reviewing procedures and penalties. I printed that agenda and slid it into the binder. Another piece of the puzzle. If they were going to talk about fences, they were going to hear from the people whose money they were threatening. The night of the meeting, the clubhouse smelled like folding chairs and stale air freshener. A few residents dotted the rows, mostly older owners who attended every month, and a handful of people like me, clutching papers, eyes tired but sharp. The board members sat at a long plastic table facing us, stacks of documents and styrofoam cups of water in front of them. When they reached the fence item on the agenda, the president summarized the initiative as a necessary step to protect property values and manage noise concerns. The treasurer mentioned fines in a careful tone, emphasizing that compliance was a goal, not revenue. Denise said they were applying the rules fairly. Then they opened the floor. I stood, binder in hand, and walked to the small microphone stand that leaned slightly to one side. Without raising my voice, I laid out the sequence. Noise complaint on March 3rd. Fence courtesy notice on March 10th. Inspection on March 24th. Second notice, and fine letter dated March 27th. I explained the midnight measurement, the uneven grade, the wording of bylaw 2.7. I described how my neighbor with a sloped yard had been fined for having a fence too short, even though the overall effect on privacy was similar. I did not accuse anyone of targeting us directly. Instead, I asked how the board accounted for grade variations when measuring, and why all the letters treated a single measurement point as absolute. I also asked whether the board had approved the daily fine structure in an open session, since no such schedule had been included in our original documents. The room was quiet except for the soft whir of an old ceiling fan. The president gave a polished answer about trusting their contractors and following industry standards. The treasurer assured everyone that fines were a last resort. Denise said owners could request a remeasurement if they believed an error had been made. None of them answered the specific questions about grade or about how they had set the dollar amounts. On the way back to my seat, I noticed two things. First, several neighbors had their phones out, taking photos of the agenda and the board members. Second, Mr. K, the treasurer, avoided looking directly at me when I passed. They had carved out a line of power and did not expect anyone to push back in such a systematic way. The board thought that a few bland answers would be enough to calm everyone down, but they had forgotten one critical detail. Every fine they stamped onto our accounts now had a paper trail that could come back on them in real dollars and real embarrassment. After the meeting, the atmosphere in the parking lot felt electric. People gathered in small clusters under the yellow glow of the streetlights, papers fluttering in their hands, breath visible in the cool night air. I stood with a few neighbors by a row of dented mailboxes, binder tucked under my arm, listening as they traded stories about notices, inspections, and the guards' measuring habits. One resident mentioned that Earl always seemed to skip the units owned by board members when he walked the back row. Another said she had seen him measuring a common area fence that backed up the retention pond, only to be waved off by a man in a polo shirt with a clipboard who looked suspiciously like a supervisor from the security company. Someone else claimed they had watched Denise walk right past a fence topper very similar to mine near one of the end units, without even pausing. Patterns were solidifying. Over the next week, I started documenting more than just my own fence. During my days off, I walked the property with my phone, pretending to be out for exercise while I snapped photos of fences that obviously deviated from the supposed standard. Some were shorter due to sloping ground. Others had decorative caps or latticework connected to them. A few had soil built up at the base, changing the apparent height. I focus especially on units owned by board members and their close friends, information that spreads easily in a compact community. I did not trespass, and I did not confront anyone. I simply built a quiet catalog of non-compliant examples that had not attracted fines, complete with timestamps and locations. Meanwhile, the fines kept ticking. I paid the initial $150 under protest, writing the check with a tight jaw, so they could not claim I was delinquent, but I refused to alter the fence yet. I submitted a formal written request for a remeasurement and a detailed explanation of their methodology, citing bylaw 2.7 and the uneven grade, and dropped it off at the management office with a copy in my binder. Days passed with no response. By the time April rolled into May, the board sent a final notice before further action, dated May 5th, warning that continued noncompliance might result in additional fines and other remedies as permitted under the governing documents, a phrase vague enough to cover almost anything. They claimed the daily fines were still accruing on their books, but offered to waive a portion if I brought the fence into compliance immediately. That letter was both a threat and a bargaining chip, and it told me something important. They were not entirely confident about their position, or they would not be dangling partial forgiveness. I reframed it in my mind as an admission that the fines hurt them too, at least from a public perception standpoint. At this point, I had a binder full of notices, measurements that did not match, photos proving uneven enforcement, and a board that had turned one noise complaint into escalating fines. They had the power to threaten my wallet and my record as a homeowner, but I had something they were not prepared for: patience, documentation, and a willingness to use their own rule, bylaw 2.7, as the center of a plan they could not easily undo. The question was no longer whether I would fix my fence. It was how I could fix it in a way that dared them to enforce their rule with the same enthusiasm on everyone. The solution came to me one night as a mental picture before it became a blueprint. I was lying awake, listening to muffled sounds on neighbors' television and the sough of my own refrigerator, when I imagined a fence so exact that any attempt to call it non-compliant would expose how sloppy the board's enforcement really was. Bylaw 2.7 said 6 feet from finished grade at the center of the shared lot line. It did not say anything about the fence being exactly 6 feet at every point, nor did it forbid the grade from being adjusted within reason. It also acknowledged that attached structures could be treated separately. Those small details, when stitched together, opened a door. I reached out to a friend from the hospital whose brother worked in construction. Without asking for anything more than general advice, I learned how contractors use string lines, stakes, and levels to establish true grade, and how they document it in case of disputes. I did not need a full tutorial. I just needed enough to understand that if I shaped the soil and the structure carefully, I could hit 6 feet on the nose at the exact measurement point the board claimed to care about, while creating a visually awkward reality they would not want to duplicate elsewhere. Over the next few evenings, when the sun hung low and the air smelled faintly of cut grass and car exhaust, I got to work behind my unit. I bought a few bags of topsoil and gravel, small enough that I could carry them without straining my back after shifts. I also picked up inexpensive cedar boards and a couple of metal stakes from the same hardware store that had sold me the tape measure. I started by using the string line technique I had learned about, anchoring at the post closest to where Earl had driven his tape during the inspection. With the level resting on the taut line, I adjusted the soil beneath it, adding or removing small amounts until the ground sloped in a controlled, gradual way. It was not drastic. I did not want anything unsafe or obvious, just precise. Then, on the inside of the fence, I carefully reworked my topper. Instead of a simple straight extension, I created a step design that reached exactly 6 feet at the center measurement point and dipped slightly lower toward the sides, following the adjusted grade. The outer appearance of the original fence remained unchanged. From the alley, it still looked like the same beige wall of boards. But on the inside, the dimensions now told a story of meticulous compliance. I documented every stage, snapping photos of the level on the string, the measuring tape at various points, the bags of soil with their weight markings visible. This became another set of evidence, not just of the fence itself, but the care I had taken to match their rule word for word. Soon, when the board tried to lean on their favorite tape measure again, they would have to confront a fence that obeyed bylaw 2.7, so literally it turned their supposed power into a spectacle in front of the whole row. What started as a private adjustment behind my patio was quietly expanding into something larger. My neighbor with the sloped yard watched my strange little construction project with growing interest. When I explained, in simple terms, how I was aligning my fence to the exact definition of center of lot line and finished grade, her eyes lit up. She had been told her fence was too short, but the rule did not actually forbid her from building a separate structure near it for privacy, as long as it did not count as part of the fence. Soon she was sketching ideas for a freestanding trellis just inside her yard, one that would not technically alter the fence height, but would block sight lines and sound in the same way. Another neighbor, tired of being warned about inconsistent privacy features, started photographing properties of board members where tall shrubs and decorative tops clearly exceeded the supposed standard. My small act of precision had become a quiet template for resistance. By the time June's inspection notice went out, announcing a follow-up review for ongoing fence compliance, I was ready. I had a meticulously rebuilt fence, a binder full of evidence, a growing collection of photos from across the community, and neighbors who were beginning to understand that the board's power depended on our confusion and isolation. They still had their measuring tape, but now I had something that cut deeper than inches, the ability to make them perform their own enforcement game under the eyes of the people they had underestimated, and to make sure that when they did, their inconsistency would be impossible to ignore. When the follow-up inspection notice hit my inbox, the subject line felt more like a dare than a reminder. It announced that on June 10th, the board and management would be walking the property again to verify ongoing fence compliance and resolve outstanding discrepancies. They made it sound as if they were doing us a favor, when everyone who had been fined knew they were really checking whether their favorite pressure tactic had worked. I printed the notice and slid it into my binder behind the final notice before further action from May 5th. The dates lined up like a slow countdown. March for first complaint, April for the policy clarification, May for threats, June for follow-up. Each page crackled when I turned it, the cheap plastic sleeves reflecting the kitchen light, as if the paper inside were sharper than it looked. The June 10th inspection became our new fixed point, circled on calendars, whispered about in the parking lot, a silent ticking clock for anyone who cared about more than paint colors. In the evenings before that date, small meetings started happening that had nothing to do with official agendas. Neighbors gathered on patios, on stoops, around open trunks in the parking lot as the air grew heavy and warm. We compared notices, photos, measurements. I shared what I had learned about bylaw 2.7, pointing out the phrases about average grade and attached structures. The woman with the sloped yard showed off her sketch for a freestanding trellis. Another neighbor, whose fence backed up to the pool, admitted he had been warned about visual inconsistency, even though the board had ignored a similar issue near a director's unit. This was starting to feel less like isolated headaches and more like a shared storyline. If someone had been narrating from above, it would have sounded like an HOA revenge story in the making, one grounded in inches and dates instead of dramatic speeches. We had 5 days until June 10th, and I knew that if we could turn a boring midweek inspection into a public demonstration, the board's favorite weapon might start cutting back toward them. While the board sent out generic reminders, we quietly prepared a stage. I used my new measuring skills to help neighbors mark the true center of their shared lot lines with discrete chalk dots in the dirt, just big enough that we could find them, small enough that casual passers-by would not notice. We added small stakes in a few places where the ground changed slope, tying string lines to show what a consistent grade should look like. In my own yard, I took the preparation a step further. I installed 2 thin, removable posts just inside the fence line, aligned with the point where Earl had pressed his tape during the first inspection. They were capped with small flat squares that caught light easily. When the afternoon sun hit them, their shadows fell in a clean line along the ground and up the fence, tracing the angle of the light like a sundial. It was a quiet, visual way to show where the true height sat when grade and angle were both taken into account. I documented everything in my binder with obsessive care, photos of the chalk marks, close-ups of the string lines, measurements with the tape held at different points to show how much the numbers changed with small shifts in position, notes about which units were owned by board members and how their fences looked under the exact same measuring conditions. The evening before the inspection, I sat at my kitchen table, binder open, listening to the distant sound of a lawnmower and the murmur of a television from a neighboring unit. I felt that strange mix of nerves and resolve that comes right before a confrontation you can't fully control. The board still had the power to assign fines and send scary letters, but my plan no longer depended on them caring about my feelings. It depended on them caring about how they looked in front of their own calm. June 10th dawned bright and harsh, the kind of early summer sun that makes every flaw stand out. Heat shimmered off the parking lot asphalt as cars pulled out for work, leaving behind a quieter, more watchful row of townhomes. I had taken another day off from the hospital, deciding that losing a little income was worth seeing this through. By mid-morning, the familiar compact car rolled into the lot, followed by the security company vehicle. Denise hopped out with her tablet, her hair pulled back tight. Earl emerged in his reflective vest, tape measure already clipped to his belt. This time, there was a third car, a sedan with the management company's logo on the side, and a man in a dress shirt who walked with the posture of someone above the everyday noise of the place. I recognized him from a photo on the company website as a regional manager. The presence of that extra layer told me one thing. Enough owners had complained that the management company felt the need to supervise. The board might have invited him to show they were being transparent. But I knew it also meant another set of eyes on their process. They started their rounds at the same end, as before, moving methodically along the row. Only this time, they did not walk alone. Residents lingered casually in their patios, some pretending to water plants, others leaning on rails as if enjoying the weather. A few strolled behind at a distance, phones in hand. The air hummed with quiet tension, mixed with the distant rattle of an air conditioner and the buzz of a power tool from somewhere down the street. When they reached my building, I was already in my patio, binder on the table, the removable posts casting clear shadows against the fence. The chalk mark at the center of the lot line looked like a tiny speck in the dirt, but I knew exactly where it was. Denise and Earl stepped into the narrow strip behind my fence, with the regional manager a few paces back, watching. Earl bent down, tape in hand, aiming for the same eroded patch he had used before. Before he could press the tab into the soil, I called out, not loudly, but clearly, that bylaw 2.7 defined the measurement from finished grade at the center of the lot line, and that the center was marked. I pointed to the chalk. The regional manager glanced at me, then at the spot Earl had been aiming for, then at the chalk mark. In a calm, neutral tone, he suggested that if the CCR specified the center as a reference point, they should follow that. Earl hesitated, then adjusted his position. He placed the tape at the chalk, extended it up along the fence to the top of the structure, and read the number. 6 feet. Exactly. Denise's brows furrowed. She asked him to check again, this time using the string line I had left slightly visible nearby, stretched between two stakes to show the adjusted grade. He obliged, perhaps annoyed, perhaps curious, pressing the tape once more from the strings level to the top of the fence. The reading stayed the same. My rebuilt fence, with its careful step design and graded soil, complied with the rule more perfectly than most original installations ever had. Then I pointed to the shadows. In the angled light, the removable post projected a clean, straight line along the fence surface, meeting at the very point where the tape ended. It was a visual confirmation, not just a numeric one, and it made the exact height visible even to someone standing farther away. The regional manager watched the way the shadows slipped along the boards, then glanced at the CCR booklet I handed him. Opened to bylaw 2.7 with the key phrases highlighted. For a moment, no one said anything. You could hear a lawnmower sputter to life in the distance and the faint slap of a basketball on concrete somewhere beyond the buildings. This was it. The board's favorite measurement had just failed them in the one place they expected it to hold. If they insisted on declaring my fence non-compliant now, they would be declaring their own rule meaningless in front of half the building and a manager who did not answer to them, and that was a deadline they had not planned for. Things moved quickly after that. The regional manager asked to see my earlier notices, which I had neatly organized in the binder. I provided the courtesy warning, the first fence notice, the second notice with a $150 fine and daily penalties, and the May 5th final notice before further action. He read through them, his eyes narrowing slightly at phrases like sole discretion and measurements conducted by on-site security personnel will be considered accurate for enforcement purposes. He asked Earl a simple question. Had they used the same precise method and reference point for all fences, including those owned by board members? The way Earl's gaze dropped to the gravel answered that before he spoke. He admitted that different measurement points had been used based on practical conditions, which was a soft way of saying it had been inconsistent. The regional manager did not scold him outright, but he did something far more damaging to the board's posture. He announced, in a voice just loud enough to carry to the nearby patios, that due to discrepancies in measurement methods, all ongoing fence fines would be temporarily suspended pending a standardized review. He also noted that any owner who had made adjustments in good faith, like I had, would have their cases prioritized for resolution. Denise's mouth tightened. She nodded as if this had been her idea all along, but her fingers tightened around her tablet. They moved on to other units, now clearly aware they were being watched. Over the next hour, the inspecting crew encountered more examples of carefully documented compliance. My neighbor with the sloped yard showed off her new freestanding trellis, which stood just inside her property, separate from a fence. She demonstrated how it provided the same privacy without technically changing fence height, and how the ground at the center line had been marked and measured. Another resident at the far end of the row pointed out shrubs and latticework attached to a board member's fence that clearly exceeded 6 feet when measured from visible grade. In each case, the regional manager insisted on consistency. If an add-on was allowed in one place, it had to be allowed in another, or it had to be addressed across the board. The more he insisted, the more obvious it became that the existing enforcement had been selective. This quiet spectacle rippled through the community. People texted photos, compared notes, and took a fresh interest in that once boring CCR booklet. What had started as a simple height rule had become a spotlight on how power had been wielded, casually, punitively, and inaccurately. For anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like just another case of HOA ridiculous rules. But for those of us living under them, it was about who got to define fairness and who had to live with the bill. A week later, the association sent out a letter that looked, at first glance, like any other newsletter. But in the middle of the page, beneath a bland headline about policy update, was a sentence I had been waiting for. The board announced a temporary moratorium on fence-related fines, pending the adoption of a standardized measurement protocol using third-party inspections and clear reference points based on bylaw 2.7. They also noted that certain previously issued fines may be adjusted or credited upon review, and they invited owners who believe they have been unfairly penalized to submit documentation. I did not have to scramble for that documentation. It was already in my binder, in chronological order, with photos and notes. My small obsession had become a ready-made case file. Denise and Earl stepped into the narrow strip behind my fence, with the regional manager a few paces back, watching. Earl bent down, tape in hand, aiming for the same eroded patch he had used before. Before he could press the tab into the soil, I called out, not loudly, but clearly, that bylaw 2.7 defined the measurement from finished grade at the center of the lot line, and that the center was marked. I pointed to the chalk. The regional manager glanced at me, then at the spot Earl had been aiming for, then at the chalk mark. In a calm, neutral tone, he suggested that if the CCR specified the center as a reference point, they should follow that. Earl hesitated, then adjusted his position. He placed the tape at the chalk, extended it up along the fence to the top of the structure, and read the number. 6 feet. Exactly. Denise's brows furrowed. She asked him to check again, this time using the string line I had left slightly visible nearby, stretched between two stakes to show the adjusted grade. He obliged, perhaps annoyed, perhaps curious, pressing the tape once more from the strings level to the top of the fence. The reading stayed the same. My rebuilt fence, with its careful step design and graded soil, complied with the rule more perfectly than most original installations ever had. Then I pointed to the shadows. In the angled light, the removable post projected a clean, straight line along the fence surface, meeting at the very point where the tape ended. It was a visual confirmation, not just a numeric one, and it made the exact height visible even to someone standing farther away. The regional manager watched the way the shadows slipped along the boards, then glanced at the CCR booklet I handed him. Open to bylaw 2.7 with the key phrases highlighted. For a moment, no one said anything. You could hear a lawnmower sputter to life in the distance and the faint slap of a basketball on concrete somewhere beyond the buildings. This was it. The board's favorite measurement had just failed them in the one place they expected it to hold. If they insisted on declaring my fence non-compliant now, They would be declaring their own rule meaningless in front of half the building and a manager who did not answer to them. And that was a deadline they had not planned for. Things moved quickly after that. The regional manager asked to see my earlier notices, which I had neatly organized in the binder. I provided the courtesy warning, the first fence notice, the second notice with a $150 fine and daily penalties, and the May 5th final notice before further action. He read through them, his eyes narrowing slightly at phrases like sole discretion, and measurements conducted by on-site security personnel will be considered accurate for enforcement purposes. He asked Earl a simple question. Had they used the same precise method and reference point for all fences, including those owned by board members? The way Earl's gaze dropped to the gravel answered that before he spoke. He admitted that different measurement points had been used based on practical conditions, which was a soft way of saying it had been inconsistent. The regional manager did not scold him outright, but he did something far more damaging to the board's posture. He announced, in a voice just loud enough to carry to the nearby patios, that due to discrepancies in measurement methods, all ongoing fence fines would be temporarily suspended pending a standardized review. He also noted that any owner who had made adjustments in good faith, like I had, would have their cases prioritized for resolution. Denise's mouth tightened. She nodded as if this had been her idea all along, but her fingers tightened around her tablet. They moved on to other units, now clearly aware they were being watched. Over the next hour, the inspecting crew encountered more examples of carefully documented compliance. My neighbor with the sloped yard showed off her new freestanding trellis, which stood just inside her property, separate from a fence. She demonstrated how it provided the same privacy without technically changing fence height, and how the ground at the center line had been marked and measured. Another resident at the far end of the row pointed out shrubs and latticework attached to a board member's fence that clearly exceeded 6 feet when measured from visible grade. In each case, the regional manager insisted on consistency. If an add-on was allowed in one place, it had to be allowed in another, or it had to be addressed across the board. The more he insisted, the more obvious it became that the existing enforcement had been selective. This quiet spectacle rippled through the community. People texted photos, compared notes, and took a fresh interest in that once boring CCR booklet. What had started as a simple height rule had become a spotlight on how power had been wielded, casually, punitively, and inaccurately. For anyone watching from the outside, it would have looked like just another case of HOA ridiculous rules. But for those of us living under them, it was about who got to define fairness and who had to live with the bill. A week later, the association sent out a letter that looked, at first glance, like any other newsletter. But in the middle of the page, beneath a bland headline about policy update, was a sentence I had been waiting for. The board announced a temporary moratorium on fence-related fines, pending the adoption of a standardized measurement protocol using third-party inspections and clear reference points based on bylaw 2.7. They also noted that certain previously issued fines may be adjusted or credited upon review, and they invited owners who believe they have been unfairly penalized to submit documentation. I did not have to scramble for that documentation. It was already in my binder, in chronological order, with photos and notes. My small obsession had become a ready-made case file. Within a month, I received a formal letter stating that my fence was now considered compliant under the updated interpretation of bylaw 2.7. The $150 fine I had paid was being credited toward my future assessments, and all daily penalties that had been accruing on their books were being removed from my account. The letter stopped short of admitting fault, but the numbers in the ledger told the truth. The board had tried to turn my fence into a revenue stream and a warning shot. Instead, their approach had backfired in a neat, clinical way, a quiet example of HOA fines gone wrong that they would be careful not to repeat. The aftermath did not come as a single, dramatic moment. It was more like a slow thaw. Over the following months, the board's attitude shifted from quietly aggressive to cautiously procedural. They adopted a written fine schedule that had to be approved in open session, and they created an appeals process that required documented evidence on both sides. The security contract was renegotiated, which was their polite way of saying Earl's company no longer patrolled our fences at strange hours. At the next annual meeting, there were more candidates for board positions and empty seats, which had never happened before. People who used to ignore the association entirely now had opinions about reserve funds, maintenance schedules, and, above all, enforcement consistency. The woman with the sloped yard ran for a director's slot and won by a comfortable margin. She brought with her a spreadsheet of cases where fines had been rescinded after the policy change, a quiet reminder that power could be checked when enough people paid attention. I did not run for the board, but I agreed to serve on a short-lived compliance advisory group that reviewed draft policies. It was unpaid and occasionally tedious, but it gave me a chance to tug rules back toward fairness before they hardened into letterhead. Standing in those small conference rooms, I sometimes thought about how a single noise complaint had snowballed into months of stress, late-night measuring sessions, and a binder full of paper that told a story in dates and inches. The emotional side took longer to settle. For a while, every envelope in my mailbox still made my stomach dip. The sight of a reflective vest in the alley could still bring back that first night of watching Earl's flashlight move along the fences at 2 a.m. The relief of having the fines reversed did not erase the feeling of being hunted for something so small. But there was a strange satisfaction, too. Not joy exactly, but a deep sense of boundary restored. My fence still stood at its precise height. My cat still lounged on the patio table, and the interior topper I had rebuilt with such care became a quiet symbol of the whole ordeal. I had not torn it down or painted it to match someone else's sense of harmony. I had reshaped it to fit the rule in a way that forced the rules enforcers to look at themselves. The night guard no longer paced behind my unit, tape measure clicking in the dark. Instead, the only sounds back there on most evenings were sprinklers, crickets, and the occasional rustle of a raccoon testing the trash lids. The drama had burned out in public view, leaving behind ordinary nights and calmer days, which is the most underrated kind of victory when you live in close quarters with other humans. As petty as it sounds, every time I walk past the clubhouse now and see the framed copy of the standardized enforcement policy they posted near the door, I feel a tiny spark of satisfaction. There, in black and white, are lines about clear notice, objective measurement standards, and owner rights to review data. None of those words came out of nowhere. They came from the months when inches were used as weapons, and a tired nurse decided she would not let her fence be the easiest target. Tell me your own fence-measuring HOA horror in one line. In the end, this little slice of homeowners association drama did not end with a cinematic courtroom scene or someone storming off into sunset. It ended with corrected ledgers, updated policies, and a long row of beige fences that suddenly mattered a lot less because people had remembered they were more than their property lines. Next time, I want to tell you about another corner of the same strange universe, where a perfectly ordinary parking sticker became a spark for a whole different kind of conflict. Picture a gated community where guest spaces are gold, and one self-appointed enforcer starts photographing license plates at dawn, filing complaints like it is a second job. The board loves a free surveillance at first, until guests stop coming, holiday gatherings shrink, and a quiet revolt over visitor access rights forces them to choose between control and community.